Hi, welcome back to the Wow stage. Now we have another panel named.
Welcome on the stage to Enara Nazarova. Hello, Enara. How are you?
Hello, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited to get to share more about virtual creative economy.
Thank you. Thanks for accepting our invitation. Enara is a New York-based marketer, community builder, and XR evangelist, helping remarkable companies build a new generation of disruptive products. So the stage is yours, Enara.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. So today we'll get to talk about a really interesting, but a bit of a new concept as it pertains to the evolution of the fashion industry in general. So you can go on to the next slide. A brief introduction about me. I'm the founder of Armoire and the host of Digital Fashion and Art Club, which is dedicated to the exploration of virtual fashion. I'm on a mission to help inspire people to actually leverage Web3 technology that will also not just shape the future of fashion, but the way that we get to express ourselves online. Next slide. One of the main questions I get asked pretty often is how exactly are people going to actually behave and also shop within virtual environments? But before understanding where we're going and how this world is going to look, I think it's very important to understand how did we actually get here today. Next slide. Fashion gives us a really great insight into an era and also tells us a lot about ourselves. So if we go back a couple hundred years, so before the sewing machine and the Industrial Revolution, clothing was made entirely by hand. The average person owned anywhere between 2 to 3 garments, one for church and special occasions, and one for daily use. So access to more clothes actually was a sign of prosperity. So high fashion can also be traced back to Georgian times, where instead of just talking about how rich you were, it was really important to show how wealthy you could actually look. And the French court at the time was influencing fashion at a really large scale, and it was almost like a membership to an elite club. So the hair was getting bigger, more ostentatious, and in the words of Dolly Patron, the higher the head, the closer to God. And fashion in many ways was a mirror of inequality, considering how the average person dressed at that time. During the Victorian period, power looms made fabric a lot more accessible to middle classes and made access to better clothes also more accessible. Now, if you fast forward to the golden years in Europe and in the US, it was marked by the spirit of roaring 20s, which was a general feeling of novelty and a break from tradition and Victorian way of life. This was also a time of high economic growth and influential advances in several technologies that shaped the century: automotive, aviation, and broadcasting via phones, radio, or film. And radio was one of the first broadcast mediums, which also became a dominant method of communication and home entertainment between 20s and 50s. This moment really marked the start of mass communication and mass marketing. So the age of consumerism has begun. Before the 19th century, the majority of the world's population also primarily shopped for necessities, and with improvements in broadcasting, advertising, and marketing campaigns could now fuel our desire for increased consumption. Next slide, please. So if you fast forward to today, we're now on a fast-moving consumption train on a collision course with climate change. We see brands taking steps towards improving aspects of their existing supply chains, but I think if we look at a recent report that Fashion for Good recently held, it clearly shows that the efforts that companies are currently putting forward are nowhere near enough. The estimated numbers that we're looking at is that it will require between 20 to 30 billion dollars worth of investment annually for the next decade for us really to reach a sustainable supply chain. And that is 10 years that we do not have. So I think changing human behavior to want is a much slower process, which actually has a name called the Diderot effect. This is insatiable desire that actually leads you to want to acquire new things in order for you to feel happy or fulfilled. So if we cannot slow the rate of consumption at the speed that we need to, we at least must slow the rate of production by giving companies new ways to earn revenue. Next slide. So for me, the real relevancy of the digital economy and virtual goods is their power to actually cut costs and supplement revenue for companies that they must use and reinvent and reinvest into their current supply chains. I think the tech sector has understood the power of being able to make something once and sell it many times, which is already a standard practice for in-game economies. Next slide. So COVID in many ways was the ultimate stress test for brands and their ability and resilience to change. Digital fashion can be a challenging space. It can also be difficult to figure out how do you as a brand fit into that landscape. But brands that do figure this out will win tomorrow. So what the way I like to think of this is that what got you here and made you successful won't get you there. And companies and designers really have to develop an appetite and a healthy relationship and a tolerance for risk. So even though we're still in the early days of the wild west of digital fashion, the competitive land grab of the immersive real estate has already begun. So transitioning from Web 2 to Web 3 is not a one size fits all solution. However, if you embrace imperfect action and experimentation, you'll be able to find your fit. So for most companies, it's not about either or, but a hybrid of both models of income. And a helpful question you can ask yourself is, what role do I want to play in an increasingly digital world? Next slide, please. If we're looking at the players that are currently already within this ecosystem, there are, of course, established companies like Gucci or Balenciaga who have a mover's advantage when it comes to financial runway and also the ability to experiment with immersive solutions at scale, such as virtual try-on solutions or in-game assets, proprietary software. But interesting thing about Web3 is that innovation no longer comes from legacy companies, but instead it can come from anywhere. And as an example, young university graduates and digital couture designers Ouroboros are leveraging their values-based approach for how they want fashion to look, and their out-of-the-box thinking to actually redefine what it means to wear a dress that can be perishable and also have a virtual digital twin. And there's also apps that understand that 3.2 billion people around the world already identify as gamers. And when we are introducing them to fashion, for them, it's a really familiar concept. So virtual styling apps like Dress are also a really interesting example of how you're able to enter the space from the app perspective. Next slide, please. And if we dig into the psychology of this a little bit deeper, humans really have used tokens to represent ourselves for as long as games have existed. We've been growing and incubating our personalities since the creation of our first usernames. And we're not just augmenting our bodies, we're also augmenting our minds as well. And for a growing population of future consumers, they are digital natives, which means they grew up with the internet all around them. And avatars are a very natural evolution of the digital self for them. And as we continue to fall deeper into the internet, digital is no longer just another channel. A really famous quote by Charles and Ray Eames said that toys and games are the prelude to serious ideas. So what younger consumers find fun today is a signal for innovations that will come tomorrow. Next slide, please. It is no secret that the huge economic losses of the pandemic also forced a lot of industries to reconsider how they do business and accelerated popularity of virtual social venues. And this didn't just start because of the pandemic. Since 2019, kids under the age of 13 have already been spending more time on Roblox than YouTube, Netflix, Facebook, and Twitter combined. And over the last year, kids and their parents became a little bit more accustomed for paying for virtual items. And when virtual in-game currencies like Robux or V-Bucks make kids' Christmas lists or their birthday wish lists, you already know that there's a behavioral shift underway. And a future-thinking CMO is paying attention to this and to the development of this virtual transaction-capable playscapes. And I think what's really important to note here is that moving with your audience as they develop is part of the long-term vision of how you can meet your strategic sales goals as well. Next slide, please. So we're heading into a fully programmable future where absolutely anything that we can own online can also be customized. And I do believe that over time, we're going to start to put more value into our virtual unperishable assets than we do in our physical ones. And despite all of the advancements in technology, I think something that will never change is the relationship that we have with ourselves and our communities. If we look at the relationship between artists and fans today, it is broken. Most creators don't make money directly from their fans. Most fans pretty passively consume fragmented pieces of their favorite artists' hyper-produced personalities, and they don't get compensated for the contributions that they make to the creator's success. So both parties already want more control, more ownership over their investments. And the next wave of social platforms, I think, are going to be more collaborative and find ways to almost like expand a perpetual dialogue between their personal work and their communities virtually. If we look at musicians as an example, playing at Madison Square Garden in New York is a really big career-making moment for musicians. In April of last year, virtual spaces allowed artists like Travis Scott, as you see in the photo here, to play a virtual concert in a game called Fortnite. They were able to make 20 million in sales from sales of digital assets alone, and the capacity of fans that visited that venue were 12 million, which is the equivalent of 578 sold out Madison Square Gardens. So the limit here is really just your imagination. To me, this is also a sign that it's virtual spaces, not just physical arenas, that are going to be the future of global artist and fan interactions. And if we go back in history, Napster disrupted the music industry by inventing streaming, and virtual assets are revolutionizing the way creatives market, distribute, and sell their work as well. And it's still early in the game, but software, hardware, and latency are rapidly improving to actually help us get here. But regardless of how good the virtual headset get, how good the field of view is, we'll always have the same basic human need to want to belong to a community and participate in collective experiences. And as more economies emerge across the board, I think what we'll be able to leverage is also in-game purchases and authenticated art. So our desire to customize will continue to persist in the metaverse. Next slide, please. And in-store shopping for clothes, we already know, engages all of our physical senses of touch, sight, hearing, smell, sometimes even taste. But online shopping relies primarily on our sense of sight alone, and that's how we will be able to make our purchasing decisions. So how can digital garments be actually experienced online? And for digital brands, they have to kind of give up control when they're entering a digital space and let go a little bit of the control of their narrative, because online, it's not what you say about yourself, but what others say about your brand that stays true. And most companies are very used to controlling the brand narrative and are generally risk averse, also for good reasons. But in addition to that, the physical craftsmanship and great materials that are the main selling point for physical goods do not translate into digital spaces natively. So when you cannot bring with you the heritage and the craftsmanship, what really comes across is your reputation. So in virtual spaces, brands will need to translate their essence effectively. And it really has nothing to do with the value of the brand in the real world, but how well you can actually enter a digital subculture. For example, in some games, streetwear will be outperforming high fashion because kids would be laughed at if they were dressed in with something with logos that were very loud, and brands would need to adapt to those changes and understand how to commit to the authenticity of those spaces. So to respond to this, brands will either need to find their way of how they want to aggressively rebrand or acquire other digital fashion houses to compete. Next slide, please. So what are the obstacles holding digital fashion back right now? For existing businesses, I think it all comes down to knowledge of where to actually begin your digital transformation. There's a fear around sinking costs when it comes to the risk of breaking into an emerging market, having to put down upfront costs and investments to reskill your staff, for operational redesign of the business and the supply chains. For new businesses, it is actually reaching a very niche and emerging market to meet profit margins and reach a sustainable monthly recurring revenue. That is a challenge. However, the market is expanding quite rapidly. For designers who want to participate in this space, usually coding, technical skills, or 3D skills are not going to be taught out of school. So you'll have to embrace actually teaching yourself how to pick up these skills and learn on the job. And for investors, it's skepticism around actually desirability of these assets or digital-only fashion. And I think if you pay attention to why the digitization is happening, you'll see that this is a long-term investment, and it will be a profitable investment in the long term. Next slide, please. So opportunities for actually breaking into digital fashion, I think, still outweigh the obstacles. Number one, reduce risk of environmental impact to actually meet aggressive sustainability goals that are needed for us to make sustainable and meaningful changes in the right direction. In many ways, sustainability is also good business. So if you want to remain relevant as a brand, it is one of the only ways for you to be able to actually put the pressure and face the pressure that is facing brands today. Number two is efficiency. You can become efficient in physical supply chains as well through automation of processes that were previously quite manual and prone to errors. And digitization can also help brands plan, create, display their assets, and also find ways to sell them digitally. So less of the guesswork and reading of the creative tea leaves in your design process and understanding how trend forecasting is actually going to work within your brand. You can also get ahead of the curve by expanding your reach and reaching the younger audience. So like we mentioned, digital native consumers, studies show that psychologically, we also view ownership of virtual assets in a very similar way that we do physical assets. So learning about which of your assets are performing well for your audience can also help you improve on-demand manufacturing of items that people already love. And lastly, collaboration. Of course, being able to collaborate with great talent and attract designers to create unusual, coveted capsule collections keeps you relevant within the cultural context as well. Next slide, please. And just to share a bit more about my work and what interests me, I believe that the next wave of social platforms will be focusing on uniting creators and their fans to build intimate connections. And that's why I'm building Armor. It's a platform for artists to be able to collaboratively create generative artifacts and digital textures. So if you think of the Tamagotchi of the 90s, that was a social petri dish for you to be able to play with a digital pet. And I think eventually our virtual identities will evolve alongside our favorite artists through advanced visual communication. Next slide, please. There's so much room for innovation in this space. I do hope that you found this primer about digital fashion helpful. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or ask any questions via email. I do host conversations on these topics on Clubhouse, so please feel free to pop in there if you'd like to learn more about this evolving medium as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enara. Thank you. And so we now will have a little break, and then we will be back with another interview. Thank you again, Enara, and ci vediamo fra pochissimo.